What's up, everybody? This is the Booch, and welcome to episode 7 of the Boochcast reviews Darkside of the Ring. Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the thumbnail. Some of you might be a little triggered by it, but we have got a hell of a show this week as we are going to be getting into Chris Benoit. Now, if you saw last week's episode of Darkside of the Ring, where I talked about the fabulous Moolah, I mentioned a disclaimer for this episode when I promoted it. So, what I want to do right now is give that disclaimer again, but this time kind of clarify what you're going to expect and what you're going to hear on the show this week. Now, on Darkside of the Ring, the Chris Benoit incident was divided into two parts. There was part 1 and there was part 2. And they were separate episodes. Like one episode aired one week, the other episode aired the following week on Vice. So I decided to do the same thing here on the Boochcast. We're going to talk about part 1 this week, and I'm going to get into part 2 on next week's episode. Now, part 1 kind of talks a little bit about the incident, but mostly gives the summary of Chris Benoit as a wrestler. It talks mostly about his wrestling career, how he got in the business, and all that other stuff in between. You know, some aspects of his personal life, but mostly everything before the double murder suicide. And then part 2 goes into detail about the double murder suicide. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to change things up a little bit. For this part 1, I'm going to talk about a little bit about what happened in part 1, but I'm going to focus it on Chris Benoit's wrestling career, and that's it. This week, I am not talking about the murder-suicide, but next week, I'm going to dive all into it. So this week, we're just talking about Chris Benoit, the wrestler, and that's it. We're talking about his wrestling career and nothing else, except for a few little things that happened in the part 1 episode. So I'll touch on it a little bit, but I'm mostly going to focus on wrestling for this one. Now, if you're one of those people that can't separate Chris Benoit the wrestler from Chris Benoit the murderer, this episode right here is not for you. In fact, I'm going to use the same quote that Chris Jericho used at the start of this episode. He said, "I want to talk about this." And he said, if you're going to give him shit and say that he's glorifying a murderer, just shut this off right now because he doesn't want to hear it. I am going to extend to the Boochcast Nation the same courtesy. If you cannot separate Chris Benoit the wrestler from Chris Benoit the murderer, this episode is not for you. Shut it off. Come back next week. Watch part 2, because part 2 will be the episode for you. Now, just to be clear, I'm not judging you if you can't separate the wrestler from the murderer. Because if I can be honest and frank with you guys, as I am on the show, I can't separate the wrestler from the murderer. I can't. Some people can, some people can't. The only reason I'm doing it now is strictly for the fans. That is the only reason I am doing this. I am being professional, and I am putting my personal feelings aside. I'm checking my ego at the door to do this. I'm doing this separation strictly for the fans. So I understand and respect completely if you can't do it. Because I'm going to be honest, this is going to be a tough episode for me. I'm going to do it, but just know this is not easy for me. So things might be a little awkward on this episode, but I promise you, next week is the episode you're definitely going to want to hear. Because I'm going to give next week my unbiased, uncut, unfiltered opinion on the Benoit double murder suicide. I may end up pissing a lot of people off on next week's episode. Next week's episode is must see. No doubt about it. Because I'm going to be getting phone calls from people I know when that episode ends. And if my co-hosts disagree with anything I say on this episode, next week's episode or any other, and they want to make videos and give their point of view, they're more than welcome. Because obviously, like I said, due to scheduling issues, I decided to go along and do all of these myself. So if they want to make their own videos and jump in, they're more than welcome. But since they couldn't be a part of this, I'm doing what I want. So just letting y'all know, we're just talking wrestling for this one. So that's going to be a problem. Shut the video off. I respect that. And tune in next week. If you can separate the wrestler from the murderer, keep on watching. Without further ado, let's get it started. So, Chris Benoit, when he was in the wrestling business, his nicknames were the Rabid Wolverine and the Canadian Crippler. He was considered to be the best technical wrestler in the history of the business. There was nobody in the ring that was better technically than Chris Benoit. And that is a fact. He is the best technical wrestler in the history of the business. He really is. Like, his technical skill was great. Now, he sucked at everything else. But technically, as a wrestler, he was great. And, of course, his wife, Nancy, was madly in love with Chris when they were together. His son, Daniel, was actually the best man at their wedding. So, they had Daniel out of wedlock, which I'm not judging, you know. I'm just stating facts. You know, obviously Daniel was the best man at the wedding, which I found to be a little hilarious, considering the age Daniel was when they got married. Like, they literally got married, and when they were done, they're like, when the wedding ceremony was over, they're like feeding Daniel in a high chair. Now, of course, June 25th, 2007 was when Chris Benoit, the murder of his wife and kid, and it was all over mainstream media. And they mentioned a little bit about that at the beginning and kind of, you know, set the whole thing up. That's when Jericho jumps in and says the things that he said. And like I said, I'll get into all that next week. But we hear a lot from David Benoit in this one. And David Benoit is Chris's other son from a previous marriage. And he says that when it came to his father, wrestling was just his job. When he was home, he was a dad. So apparently Benoit was not able to become his gimmick, and he was able to separate the gimmick from the human being, which is kind of easy when you don't really have much of a gimmick. So I'm going to be honest, that didn't really impress me, because for a wrestler to become their gimmick, you must first have a gimmick. And Chris Benoit never really had much of a gimmick. First time I've heard somebody say a wrestler wasn't their character, and it didn't impress me at all, because he had no gimmick. So his grandfather, or Chris Benoit's dad, took Chris to his very first wrestling show in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is where Chris Benoit was from and lived for most of his life. He was inspired when he saw the Dynamite Kid. He inspired him to become a wrestler. He idolized him from his work ethic to his in-ring ability. And he did the signature move, the flying headbutt, just like Dynamite Kid. So Dynamite Kid was the one that inspired him to do the flying headbutt off the top rope. And he always gave 120% in the ring during every match he had. And there's obviously a lot of truth to that, because Chris Benoit had a lot of amazing matches throughout his career, and I never saw one where he didn't put forth any effort. Like, of course, at the Royal Rumble 2001, he had the ladder match with Chris Jericho, which Jericho considers to be one of the best matches of his whole career. And it was an epic ladder match. He had at Royal Rumble 2003, he had a match with Kurt Angle for the WWE Championship, which most people considered to be the best match of 2003. Like, that was the match that everybody loved the most for that year. It was match of the year for everybody. Also, he fought Kurt Angle in the 30-minute Ultimate Submission match at Backlash 2001, which is quite possibly my personal favorite Chris Benoit match. Was that. I love that Ultimate Submission match. And also winning the tag team titles were Chris Jericho against the two-man power trip, Steve Austin and Triple H, the night Triple H tore his quad. I remember Benoit was giving this pep talk to Jericho about, everything they've been through and, everything they went through training in Stu Hart's dungeon to wrestling down south, you know, all the crap they went through in WCW, and that was their moment to shine, and they got that moment. And then, of course, he had a great match with Bret Hart, which was a tribute to Owen. They had an Owen Hart tribute match on Nitro that was just pure wrestling, nothing else, and it was phenomenal. He also had the match with Dean Malenko at Hog Wild in '96, which was also pure wrestling. Went to a draw. There was like double overtime. Benoit in the end, he did kind of cheat to win because he was the heel, but up until that moment, it was pure unadulterated wrestling with him and Dean Malenko. And then, of course, he had a match with Shawn Michaels on Monday Night Raw on February 16th, 2004. That was another great match. And I remember at the end of the match, that was when Austin announced that at WrestleMania 20, it would be a triple threat match between Triple H, Chris Benoit, and Shawn Michaels. And, of course, we all know at WrestleMania 20, that was when Benoit won the World Heavyweight title, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then, of course, it's at Starrcade 99, Chris Benoit, when he was still in WCW, had a ladder match with Jeff Jarrett for the U.S. title. That was very well done, very violent. And then, of course, he had, at Vengeance 2003, him and Eddie Guerrero had a pure wrestling match. Of course, Eddie Guerrero did the whole, Allah, Achi, Asteel. But even those moments, everything was great. It was psychology. It was storytelling. It was believability. It was wrestling done right. And, it almost puts to shame so much of the bullshit circus wrestling that we see today. And the fact that, one nice thing I'll say about Benoit, because like I said, we're separating the wrestler from the murderer on this episode, is Benoit didn't do that shit. He occasionally dove outside the ring. He had a couple high spot things that he did, but he didn't make a habit of it. And he was always, always, always believable in every single thing that he did. And that, like, watching these matches back makes me realize how great wrestling really used to be. When people talk about wrestling being like in the old days, it really was good because you could believe everything that you were seeing. And David talks about getting his first Nintendo and playing as his dad in the game WCW Mayhem, which I'll be honest, I remember that video game, and no disrespect to David, but that video game came out in like 1999. It was god awful. That was a terrible wrestling game. It really was. I remember playing as Goldberg, and the one thing I hated about the game was it was the only wrestling game I ever saw where Goldberg hits the jackhammer and it doesn't immediately turn into a pin. He does the jackhammer and then he gets back up and then you have to hit the button to pin him. Like, the controls were fucked up. The graphics were horrific. It was not an upgrade at all. It was just sad. It was really sad to play that game. But anyway, Jim Ross says that Benoit was on the radar as a wrestler since the 80s. He says he's a wrestling fan, and if you're not a wrestling fan, how can you not be a fan of Chris Benoit's work? He was a natural since he was young. Now, today I can answer that question. How can you not be a fan of Chris Benoit's work? But like I said, not going there today. But back then, before June 25th, 2007, I had to be a fan of Chris Benoit's in-ring work. Today, I don't really care. Jericho said he was inspired by Chris Benoit watching him in Stampede Wrestling. The guys in that company were small as far as height and weren't like the larger-than-life wrestlers and gimmicks that you saw in WWE. He also says Benoit was the most intense and believable performer he had ever been in the ring with. And, of course, Benoit, was in Stu Hart's Stampede Wrestling because he trained in the Hart family dungeon, receiving education from Stu Hart. And he emulated both, like I said, Dynamite Kid and as well as Bret Hart. And he actually adopted the sharpshooter as one of his finishing moves as far as submissions go in honor of the Hart family. The snap suplex, which the Dynamite Kid did. He was also called Dynamite Chris Benoit because he was so similar to the Dynamite Kid. And in his first match, he attempted the diving headbutt before learning how to land correctly and had the wind knocked out of him. He said he would never do the move again at that point, but later he went and did it. He did it anyway. His debut match was a tag team match on November 22nd, 1985 in Calgary, Alberta, where he teamed up with the remarkable Rick Patterson against Butch Moffat and Mike Hammer, which Benoit's team won the match after Benoit pinned Moffat with a sunset flip. The first title Benoit ever won was the Stampede British Commonwealth Mid-Heavyweight Championship on March 18th, 1988 against Gama Sin. During his tenure in Stampede, he won 4 international tag team and 3 more British Commonwealth titles and had a lengthy feud with Johnny Smith that lasted for over a year, which both men traded back and forth the British Commonwealth title. And in 1989, Stampede closed its doors, and with the recommendation from Bad News Allen, Benoit departed for New Japan Pro Wrestling. But one of the things that Jericho said about Benoit was, he could see things before they happened. His first job was wrestling, and his last job was wrestling. It was all he ever did. It was all he knew how to do, and it was the only thing he ever earned a paycheck from, which that says a lot about Chris Benoit, because there's so many guys in the business that have day jobs before they make it famous. In fact, even today, there's a lot of indie wrestlers that when they're not wrestling in the ring, they're off doing other jobs because it's how they earn a living in between gigs, because some of them aren't at a point in their career where wrestling's all they do. But I will say, for Benoit to have that throughout his entire career says a lot, especially like in the beginning. You don't make a lot of money in the business. You really don't, until eventually you establish yourself as a name. And Dean Malenko said Benoit was very quiet, reserved, and kept to himself. When the bell rang, he was a whole different person, a very focused individual, and took nothing less than being perfect. And I can kind of relate to that in a way, because I know myself personally, like usually when I'm in like comedy clubs or around groups of people, I tend to be very quiet, reserved, and keep to myself. I like to sit in a corner and just go over my set list. And then once I hit the stage, that's when my personality would jump out. So if you saw me out somewhere at a show, if you saw me before the show, you wouldn't believe that I was about to go on stage and tear that whole place up, because I would always be like quiet, reserved, memorizing my set, making sure I'm ready to start the show, because I don't want to be the guy that hangs out with everybody and parties and then goes up on stage and doesn't deliver the show. I'm always trying to remind myself, people are there to see the show. Once the show's over, I'll hang out with anybody who wants to hang out with me. I'll drink, I'll party, I'll do all that shit. But before the show, I'm very reserved, I like to say to myself. And Jericho said one time he nailed Benoit with a spin kick, and he didn't hit him in the head because you're not supposed to. You're supposed to time it to where you take the bump before the leg even hits you. But Benoit thought he took the bump wrong, and even though nobody noticed and nobody cared, he did. And Jericho goes in the back, and he sees Benoit doing like 500 Hindi squats. No one told me how to do it, but he was doing it to punish himself because he fucked up in the ring. So he was like punishing himself to make sure I never make this mistake again. And there was one aspect of this episode and this overall documentary that I didn't like, and I'm going to address that right now. I didn't like that Eddie Guerrero was grouped into this episode. I mean, look, I know that Eddie and Chris were friends, and I know later they mentioned that Chris was depressed when Eddie died. But they started going into too much detail about his career, and Vicky was telling way too many stories about Eddie, and I felt they should have saved some of this for if they want to do an episode on Eddie in a later season. Eddie Guerrero, with his career, his demons, and his inevitable death, Eddie Guerrero deserves his own episode of Darkside of the Ring. So the stories that Vicky told about Eddie, like them practicing moves in the bedroom or liking Eddie's charisma. She even said at one point she liked his ass, thought he was attractive. They were great stories, but I didn't like seeing them in this episode. I don't want Eddie Guerrero's legacy grouped in with Benoit's that closely. Because unlike Benoit, Eddie was a good man up until he died. So I didn't like the fact that Eddie was grouped in too much. I understood there were certain aspects where Eddie's name had to be brought up because he and Benoit were such good friends. But a lot of these stories they told about Eddie, you could have saved those for another episode of Darkside of the Ring. Give Eddie Guerrero his own story. Let him be talked about and recognized. And I know it's going to sound weird, but honored that way. Give Eddie Guerrero his own episode. Because unlike Benoit, Eddie Guerrero was a good man. I'll just say that. Now, the matches Eddie and Chris had were violent, and they were stiff with each other. Eddie hated wanting to wrestle Chris in the beginning. He every time he had to wrestle Chris, he would get pissed off because they knew they were going to be violent in the ring. And of course, this is in New Japan, where Benoit wrestled as the Pegasus Kid or Wild Pegasus, and I think Eddie was like Black Tiger. That was Eddie Guerrero's gimmick. So, of course, while he was in New Japan, he spent a year training in the New Japan dojo with the younger wrestlers to improve upon his abilities. While he was in the dojo, he spent months doing strenuous activities like push-ups and floor sweeping before stepping into the ring. He made his debut in New Japan officially in 1986 under his real name. In 1989, he started wearing a mask and assuming the name the Pegasus Kid. Benoit said numerous times that he originally hated the mask, but it eventually became a part of him. While with New Japan, he came to his own as a performer and quickly acclaimed matches with luminaries like Jushin Thunder Liger, Shinjiro Otani, Guerrero's Black Tiger, and El Samurai in their junior heavyweight division. In August 1990, he won his first major championship, the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship from Jushin Thunder Liger. He eventually lost his title in November 1990, and in July 91 in Japan, and November 91 in Mexico, his mask, back to Liger, forcing him to reinvent himself as Wild Pegasus. Benoit spent the next couple of years in Japan, winning the Best of Super Juniors tournament twice, in 1993 and 1995. He went on to win the inaugural Super J Cup tournament in 94, defeating Black Tiger, Gato, and the Great Sasuke in the finals. He wrestled outside New Japan occasionally to compete in Mexico and Europe, where he won a few regional championships, including the WWF Light Heavyweight Championship. He held that title for over a year, having many 40-plus minute matches with Delano III. And then, of course, we get to Sandra Toffoloni, who is the sister of Nancy Benoit. And she says her sister got in the business by her first husband, who was a wrestling fan, and they would go to the matches together regularly. One day, a promoter saw her and thought she would make a great valet. She later met Kevin Sullivan, who is one of the greatest promoters and bookers that ever existed in wrestling, hands down. At the time, Kevin Sullivan had a satanic gimmick where he shaved an X into his chest hair. He also wore a hood, which, Kevin Sullivan would do regularly in WCW. And if you watch the UCW Extreme Spring Stampede, you can see Kevin Sullivan coming out in a hood along with the zombies from The Walking Dead that came out with him, the Walkers. So we had him wearing a hood then too. Now, Nancy and Kevin started off as friends, and they later fell in love and got married. Kevin's gimmick was he was the Prince of Darkness, and he had an army of darkness behind him. And Nancy would be by his side as the Fallen Angel. And that was Nancy's ring name in the beginning, was the Fallen Angel. The idea for the name came from a Uriah Heep poem, and she was one of the first to understand the art of being a valet. And she was an instrumental part of getting heat because people believed in the gimmick. She was good at getting heat and getting the crowd angry, and she was a master at it. And here's how much people believed her gimmick. There's days where she would be at a gas station pumping gas, not even as a gimmick, just a regular day where she's putting gas in the car, and religious people would lay hands on her to try and free the demon that was possessing her. And Nancy loved it because they knew they're buying into the gimmick. They're falling for it. They believe. Now, later, as a team, they went to WCW. And, Chris Benoit came to WCW originally in June 1992, teaming up with a Canadian wrestler named Biff Wellington. Elvis would laugh his ass off at that name. For the NWA World Tag Team Championship Tournament. They were defeated by Brian Pillman and Jushin Thunder Liger in the first round at Clash of the Champions. He did not return to WCW until January 93 at the next Clash of the Champions, defeating Brian Armstrong. A month later at Super Bowl III, he lost to Too Cold Scorpio, getting pinned with only 3 seconds left in the 20-minute time limit. At the same time, he formed a tag team with Bobby Eaton. After he and Eaton lost to Scorpio and Marcus Bagwell, a.k.a. Buff the Stuff, at Slamboree, Benoit headed back to Japan. Then he was in ECW. In August 1994, Benoit began working with Extreme Championship Wrestling in between tours of Japan. He was built as a dominant wrestler there, gaining notoriety as the Crippler after he put Rocco Rock out. In his first appearance, Benoit competed in a one-night, 8-man tournament for the vacant NWA World Heavyweight Championship, losing to Too Cold Scorpio in the quarterfinals. At November to Remember, Benoit accidentally broke Sabu's neck within the opening seconds of the match. The injury came when Benoit threw Sabu with the intention that he'd take a face-first pancake bump. But Sabu attempted to turn midair and take a backdrop bump instead. He did not achieve full rotation and landed almost directly on his neck. After the match, Benoit returned to the locker room and broke down over the possibility that he might have paralyzed someone, so he's legit freaking out. Paul Heyman, the head of the booker of ECW at the time, came up with the idea of continuing the Crippler moniker for Benoit. From that point until his departure from ECW, he was known as Crippler Benoit. When he returned to WCW in October of 1995, WCW modified his name to Canadian Crippler Chris Benoit. In the Rise and Fall of ECW book, Heyman commented that he planned on using Benoit as a dominant heel for quite some time before putting the company's main title, the ECW World Heavyweight Championship, on him to be the long-term champion of the company. But that was, of course, before he left for WCW. During his time, Benoit and Dean Malenko won the ECW World Tag Team titles. It was Benoit's first American title from Sabu and Taz in February 1995 at Return of the Funker. After winning, they were initiated into the Triple Threat stable, led by ECW World Heavyweight Champion Shane Douglas, as Douglas attempted to recreate the Four Horsemen, as the three-man contingency held all three of the ECW championships at the time. Malenko also held the World Television Championship, in addition to being a tag team champion. The team lost the championship to the Public Enemy that April at Three-Way Dance. Benoit spent some time in ECW feuding with the Steiner brothers and rekindling the feud with Too Cold Scorpio. He was forced to leave ECW after his work visa expired. Heyman was supposed to renew it, but he failed to make it on time. So Benoit left ECW in August 95 as a matter of job security and the ability to enter the United States. And he toured Japan until WCW called. So when he came to WCW, Chris also came with Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko. So all three of them came into WCW at the same time. When they came into WCW, by this time, Kevin Sullivan became the booker. And Nancy had changed her name from the Fallen Angel to Woman. Just Woman. W-O-M-A-N. Woman. So if you watch any classic WCW shows on the network and you see Woman walking out to the ring, either with Kevin Sullivan or Chris Benoit or even Ric Flair, her name is Woman. That's Nancy Benoit. And she's independent and takes shit from no one. And that was basically Woman's gimmick. Just not take shit from anybody. Now, right around this time, Kevin Sullivan and Chris Benoit started feuding. And during that feud, Woman eventually turned on Kevin Sullivan and aligned with Chris Benoit. And the joke is that Kevin booked his own divorce because eventually Nancy left Kevin Sullivan to go be with Chris Benoit. And basically, WCW would film vignettes with Chris and Nancy being intimate together. Nancy eventually left Kevin and went with Chris in real life. And when Kevin and Nancy would fight, Chris was being a friend to Nancy, so that's ultimately what brought them together. In fact, during the match at Bash at the Beach 1997, Chris Benoit had a match with Kevin Sullivan where he potatoed the shit out of him in the ring. Just for a shoot, beat the fucking piss out of Kevin so much that the fight continued in the back even after the match. They're fighting in the back. And it's because Kevin Sullivan was accused of being abusive towards Nancy. So apparently Nancy had some black eyes or something, or a black eye, and Chris Benoit saw it, got pissed off, and just beat the fuck out of Kevin in the ring for that. Now, Darkside of the Ring reached out to Kevin Sullivan for comment. He wasn't on camera. There was no audio or video, but they wrote a statement saying that Kevin denies that any abuse ever took place. In the documentary, they're saying Kevin Sullivan was abusive. Kevin is claiming he wasn't. Now, personally, I have no idea who's telling the truth. I do know this. I've never met Chris Benoit. I never met Nancy. I have met Kevin Sullivan. I'm friends with Kevin Sullivan. I've ridden in a car with Kevin Sullivan. We traveled to multiple UCW wrestling shows together. I've taken him to the airport. I've taken him to hotels. We've sat in cars for hours, driving, talking, joking. Sometimes we've had a few arguments. So I do know that Kevin can get angry when he wants to be, but he's never been physically violent towards me. And in fact, one time he was yelling and screaming at me and I got nervous because I was driving a car and I'd heard so many stories about Kevin. I didn't know if he was going to hit me. So I legit was freaking out. And when he saw that I was freaking out, he eventually cooled down and apologized to me. And he felt bad about it. And I won't get into too much detail. I'll just say it was a discussion over Trump. And that's all I'm going to say about that. As far as being abusive, I don't know. So I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm not going to say if it's good or bad or if he did it or not. But I'll say this. For the sake of argument, hypothetically, let's say it did happen. Let's say Kevin really did punch Nancy in the face and give her a black eye. I still consider him a better man than Chris Benoit. Still. Because, yeah, with Kevin Sullivan, Nancy got a black eye or two. With Chris Benoit, she got choked to death. Who's the bigger asshole? I say Chris. But anyway, back to the story. Nancy's sister said she loved Chris because Nancy loved her and he helped her sister through that time. Now, David said that Nancy treated him like she was her own kid. And he never used the word step. The word step was never used. They were just family. And David and Daniel were true siblings. David said he loved Daniel and that they had dreamed about one day becoming tag team champions together. Like David and Daniel Benoit, the tag team champions, which would have had a nice ring to it. It would have been interesting to see. Now, of course, in WCW, the bigger guys got all the TV spots in the main events. And Chris got fed up because he never saw himself in a main event in WCW as long as those bigger guys were there. So he walked out with Guerrero, Malenko, and Saturn, and they went to WWE. And Benoit became a no-nonsense Clint Eastwood type performer. Now, before I get into the rest of this, Benoit said that they would never take him seriously as a main eventer. Which doesn't make sense because the day he left and walked out on the company, he was the WCW World Heavyweight Champion. He beat Sid Vicious to win the fucking title. When Kevin Sullivan was the booker. So despite the fact that Chris Benoit took Kevin's wife, he put the world title on him, even though everybody in the booking committee, from Mike Graham to J.J. Dillon, all said, don't put the world title on this guy. He's not a world's champion. And I'm going to get a lot of heat for this, but in reality, he's not. Like I said, he's great in the ring, but that's all he brought to the table. If that's all you're bringing to the table, then you're not worthy of being a world champion. The best you can hope for is a mid-card title. That's what Benoit was at his heart and core, a mid-card wrestler. And he didn't become a top guy until all the top guys left. And that's not an insult. That is just a fact of life. He was perceived as too short, which is why he wasn't a main eventer. He had great matches. And when Daniel was older, Chris took him to the matches. And he hated being away from home and missing holidays. Jericho suggested to him, we'll ask for those days off. But Benoit never wanted to do that. And, you know, that's a tough thing to do. Because that's the thing about entertainers, like, or wrestlers or whatever, or sports people or whatever. They never like to ask for days off or take any days off. Because they know in the world of entertainment, you're out of sight, out of mind. If you're off TV for too long, eventually fans forget about you. They get to a point where the company can function without you. And nobody wants to walk away like that. So that's the other issue. But, if you hate being away from your family, at some point you got to make a choice or find a way to balance it. If Benoit had put his family first, he probably wouldn't have been in the spot that he's in wrestling. But I think he would have had a better family life. But I think he became one of those guys that loved the business. He was married to the business and dating his family. And I'm not judging him for it. I'm just saying it looked like that's what happened. Now, eventually, Chris found religion when Eddie started teaching it to him. At one point, Eddie gave him a Bible, and Chris started reading it. And Benoit had trust issues. One of the few people in this world he trusted was Eddie Guerrero. Now, he started getting bigger as a wrestler, and Nancy was supportive and took care of everything else that didn't involve wrestling, so Chris could focus only on that. That is an incredible woman. Because Nancy was also in the business, but apparently, after WCW folded, she pretty much left. And she became the most supportive wife in the whole world. Because if you're going to be a professional wrestler, you need a woman like that in your corner all the time. If you want to be successful at anything in life, you need a woman that can be in your corner like that. Those women are hard to find. And if you got one, you got to hold on tight and not let go. Well, Nancy was one in a million. And of course, at WrestleMania 20, Benoit won the World Heavyweight title in the main event of WrestleMania. Eddie Guerrero came out with his WWE title that he had won back in February to celebrate with him, and that was the final moment of that WrestleMania. Now, David says he wished they had retired right after that. And ultimately, that was a great moment for Chris Benoit. And what's also great about that was, in order to get to that main event, he won the Royal Rumble in 2004. And he's the only other wrestler besides Shawn Michaels and Edge to win the Royal Rumble as the number one entrant. And here's the thing. For the most part, WWE does no mentioning of Chris Benoit. And I understand why. And I'm not saying they need to talk about Chris Benoit all the time, but when it comes to stats, when it comes to numbers, you have to talk about the stats. I'm not saying you have to praise him, but you can't ignore stats like that in a certain situation. Like you don't have to show classic Chris Benoit matches all the time. You don't have to make a best of Chris Benoit DVD. But for example, when you talk about major milestones like the Royal Rumble, when you list all the Royal Rumble winners, you have to include Chris Benoit as the 2004 Royal Rumble winner. Because eventually people are going to Google that and find it anyway. It doesn't glorify Chris. It glorifies the Rumble. Okay? Like you said, there's going to be 3 guys who mentioned the Rumble at number 1. Most people are going to know Shawn Michaels did it in 1995. Most people are going to know Edge did it in 2021. Especially since it's this fucking year that it happened. But Benoit did it in 2004. You're going to have to mention all of these stats. You're going to have to make that clear. Especially when you're in situations like, what was the main event of WrestleMania 20? Benoit versus Hunter versus Michaels. Or, Randy Orton. Who did Randy Orton beat to win his first World Heavyweight title and become the youngest world champion in WWE history? It was Chris Benoit. So there are some instances where his name has to be mentioned, but it's not praising him. It's just acknowledging history. There are certain moments where Benoit was a part of history. Now, there are other parts where he wasn't. Benoit accomplished a few things, but he didn't accomplish a whole lot in WWE, outside of the things that I mentioned. It's easy to ignore other matches or certain rivalries and shit like that because they weren't instrumental to a lot of people's success. But if you're going to talk about, people he held the tag team titles with, you may have to include those things. Like the fact that he was a tag team champion with Kurt Angle. He was a tag team champion with Jericho and Edge. He was a tag team champion with Dean Malenko and Perry Saturn and multiple other wrestlers. They're going to talk about certain careers and stuff. Like, Stampede Wrestling, him and Biff Wellington and Lance Idol and Keith Hart and Ben Basarab. Like, he's won tag titles with those people. So you got to talk about those certain things. Like, he won Feud of the Year against Michael and Triple H 2004. His match with Kurt Angle versus Edge and Rey Mysterio was Match of the Year for 2002. He was voted Best Brawler in 2004. Now, that's Wrestling Observer stuff. And they're obviously going to mention Benoit. So there are some cases where his name has to come up, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're praising him. You're just mentioning the stats. And those are the instances where Benoit's name needs to be mentioned. Other than that, keep it quiet. But those are cases where his name has to come up. And, obviously, here on the Boochcast, when Gator and I do our classic pay-per-view reviews, we mention Chris Benoit and we mention the matches. And we don't talk about the murder or anything like that. We just focus on the actual match that took place. And that's us being professional. That's us being analysts. And that's us looking back on this classic pay-per-view. So those are the only instances on the Boochcast where we talk about Chris Benoit and talk about his in-ring work and praise it in that regard. But the rest of the time, we don't mention his name for reasons I won't get into on this episode. I'll go into more about that next week, so I want to stay professional here on this particular episode. Now, eventually in this episode, they talk about Eddie Guerrero passing away and the details surrounding his death. Now, this instance, I kind of understood because it leads to something with Benoit. But like I said, the rest of the stories they were talking about Eddie, I didn't like in here, and they should have saved that for a Darkside of the Ring episode with Eddie. But anyway, when Chavo called Chris to tell him Eddie passed away, he just started wailing on the phone. He could barely get through his tribute promo when they did a tribute to Eddie Guerrero. Benoit at the funeral cried on Jericho's shoulder to the point where his tears soaked through Jericho's suit jacket onto his shirt. And no one had ever seen Chris show emotion before. That was the interesting thing. He never showed emotion like that or got that emotional until Eddie passed. And after Eddie's death, Benoit became a hermit. He didn't talk to anybody. He didn't look at anybody. He was professional, but that was it. After the funeral, he got on a plane and flew to Europe for a wrestling show when most people felt he should have just been home grieving. But Benoit was one of those guys that's like, I got to keep working. And Nancy helped Vicky through the grieving process. Like, Nancy would come over and help Vicky with the kids because Vicky was just inconsolable in the bed. But eventually, she got Vicky up out of bed and said, "You got to get up. You got to go take a shower. We got to go out. We got to get a babysitter. You got to start picking the pieces of your life back together." And Vicky always credited Nancy for toughening her up and getting her through that tough time. So Nancy stayed with Vicky for about a month while Benoit was on the road. Now, Chris would occasionally come visit during that time when he was on his off days, and he would lay on Eddie's side of the bed, grab his pillow, and start crying. Like, obviously, because, when you're married, you got your husband has one side of the bed, the wife has the other. So whatever Eddie's side of the bed was, Chris laid on that. He wouldn't touch Vicky's side, and he would cry. And then he would also be in Eddie's home gym. He would sit on the bench press, not benching, just sitting up, like how I'm sitting in this chair, and he would just start crying. And Vicky was trying to console him, and he said that he was lost without Eddie. He said Chris would go to wrestling shows, and he'd have the professional game face on. Like, he would be professional. He would, talk to people if he had to go over matches and stuff or promos. But he was sad all the time, and he was depressed. And apparently, Nancy and Chris would fight for no reason. Chris would just get mad and defensive and antisocial. Chris just shut down and wouldn't talk to anybody, not even his wife. So eventually, Nancy and his sister gave him a journal to write in so he could write to Eddie. And it was a way to talk to Eddie even though he wasn't here. And right around this time, in 06, 07, Nancy wanted him to leave the business. According to her sister wanted him to leave the business because mentally it was killing him. And every time he went to the arena, all he could think about was Eddie. Every arena they went to, he thought about a match he had with Eddie or a moment Eddie had. He was grief-stricken. So we can already tell that the emotional depression that Benoit is going through, the mental shit was Eddie Guerrero's death, and he never fully got over it. And for now, that's where I'm going to end this episode of Darkside of the Ring. Like I said, I'm just covering the wrestling. And like I said, Chris Benoit as a wrestler was phenomenal. He was truly a gifted wrestler in the ring. And, a lot of people, like I said before, they separate the wrestler from the murderer, which is what I did in this episode, or at least tried to. And I'll admit, I took a couple jabs at Chris, but I was very tame compared to the stuff that I want to say. But, like I said, Benoit did have a hell of a great wrestling career. He accomplished a lot in the business. And up until this whole incident happened, he was an inspiration to a lot of wrestlers. And Chris, in the ring, he was very talented. From a promo standpoint, he wasn't very good. Like I said, I don't think he was world championship material, but he did win the world title. And if he was still alive, he probably would have won at least a few more. And that's all I can really say right now. So I'm going to wrap this episode up of Boochcast Covers Darkside of the Ring. Tune in next week. Next week, I will be going into part 2 of the Chris Benoit incident, which means next week, I'm going to be talking about the double murder suicide. And it's going to be raw. It's going to be uncut. Some people already have an idea of what I'm going to say, and they can't believe I'm going to go there, but I'm going to fucking go there. I was calm, tame, and professional for this episode, and it was not easy to do. That's why I threw a couple jabs. I had to get some of it out. But next week, I am going full throttle. Full fucking throttle with Chris Benoit. So, make sure you guys follow the Boochcast on SoundCloud. Go to soundcloud.com/Boochcast, BOOCHCAST. Also, like us on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/The Boochcast. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Boochcast. Go to twitch.tv/The Boochcast. Follow us on Twitch. Also, support the show through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/The Boochcast. You guys know the spiel by now. All the links are in the description box to where you can follow the show and check out everything. And I'll talk to you guys next week. Until then, pizza, baby!